The first thing I learned about deep drift navigation is that the charts lie by omission. They mark a sector as clear and mean only that nothing worth noting has moved through it recently. Not that nothing is there. Not that nothing waits. The Accord's survey teams are thorough when the sector produces something worth cataloging. Ore deposits, transit corridors, habitable margins. They are less thorough about the spaces between. Thresh-9 was in a space between. I did not know this when the drive on the Veth Anoral massing failed. I did not know it when I sent the emergency beacon on all registered Accord frequencies and waited, and got back the automated routing acknowledgement. That means the signal was received by a relay buoy and will be forwarded to the nearest Accord coordination hub within 72 standard hours. I did not know it when 72 hours became 96 and then 120, and the only responses were 2 automated survey pings from vessels that noted our beacon and logged our position as a data point without diverting. I knew it by the time engineer second vessel came to the command console on shaking legs and told me that the atmospheric recyclers were at 6% efficiency and declining, that we had perhaps 9 days of breathable air for 3,014 workers before the mix shifted past survivable margins, and that she had done the calculation 4 times because she did not want to tell me the answer. I am a shift foreman. I was elected to that position 11 years ago by the workers of the Kethfaral labor collective aboard the processing platform Arash station. Because I had the most intact primary limb segments of any candidate, and because I had never once shorted a worker there, mission allocation. I am not a navigator. I am not a diplomat. I am not a distress protocol specialist. I is the person the workers look to when things go wrong. And so I sat at the Massing's command console in the pale recycled light and read the responses to our beaconin. All automated, all logged, none of them a voice. And I tried to find something in them that I could bring to 3,014 frightened workers as news. There was nothing to bring. On the 4th day, I sent a targeted signal to the Velshar Accord coordinating station at Marin Hub, which is the nearest staffed facility to the outer drift lanes. The response came in 11 hours. A courteous automated notice informing me that the outer drift lanes are not patrolled under current Accord charter, that vessels operating in undesignated sectors do so at their own navigational risk, and that the nearest Accord rescue-rated vessel was currently committed to a priority extraction in the Teth corridor and could not divert. The response included a secondary routing option, suggesting I file a formal assistance claim with the Labor Collective Administrative Office, processes emergency petitions within 30 standard days. Vethal had revised her estimate down to 8.5 days. I filed the petition anyway, because I had nothing else to file, and because the workers were watching. Then I sat back in the command chair. It was sized for a smooth-skinned species, and my chitinous foremost limbs did not fit off comfortably against the armrests, which is a small and stupid detail that I remember clearly because my mind had begun to fix on small and stupid details as a way of not fixing on the larger ones. And I opened the sector chart and looked at what was around us. The chart showed the outer drift lanes. It showed the relay buoy at Vector Mark 7. It showed the gas giant Thresh primary, pale amber, 500,000 kilometers to our coreward side. Its rings a faint scratch of reflected light in the navigation display. And it showed gray notation with a small derelict status flag, the station designation Thresh-9, orbiting at the gas giant's L4 point. Operational status, non-functional, last active survey date 14 months prior. I stared at it for a long time. A non-functional station is not a resource. The Accord's derelict status designation means the facility has failed its operational review. Power, plant below minimum threshold, life support inactive, no registered crew, not worth the salvage cost. The gray notation is a warning to navigators. Do not expect aid here. Do not dock expecting service. A stain is a dead thing, a hull and some metal, and the only reason it appears on the chart at all is because it is large enough to constitute a navigational hazard. Thresh-9 was 140,000 kilometers from our position, and we were 8.5 days from the end of breathable air. I did the mathematics that a person does when there are no good options. I calculated the drift time on emergency maneuvering thrusters, without the main drive. I calculated whether it would cost more air to move or to stay still. I sat with those numbers for 6 hours. Then I told Vethel to begin the drift burn, slow and steady, toward the L4 point. She looked at the notation on the chart. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "It's dead, Foreman." "Everything is dead until you look at it," I said, which is not wisdom. It is something my clutch elder told me when I was young and stubborn, and I have said it several times since then, in situations that did not warrant it. I said it then because I had no better answer, and because I needed to move. We began the drift. It took 31 hours on emergency maneuvering to cross to the L4 point. 31 hours, in which the atmospheric recyclers declined from 63% to 51%, and the CO2 scrubbers began cycling on the secondary circuit, and the workers on the lower processing decks started to notice the smell that recycled air gets when the scrubbers are laboring. I have been in poor air before. Every Kethverol labor worker has. It is a particular quality of exhaustion, not quite sleepiness, not quite nausea, something that lives in the soft tissue behind the compound eyes and makes every movement feel slightly heavier than it should. We had 3,000 workers in that air, and I stood at the forward observation port and watched Thresh-9 grow from a gray notation on a chart to a shape in the dark, and I tried to find something I could offer them. The shape resolved. It was a standard mid-range Accord orbital processing platform. The old modular design, 6 habitat rings around a central core, built in the format that was common 40 years ago, and is now considered obsolete. The rings were dark. The navigation lights were dark. The solar collection arrays were folded in, which happens automatically when a station powers down, and the folded arrays gave the hull a collapsed, sunken look, the way a creature looks when it draws in on itself. Dead, in other words, exactly as advertised. I was about to tell Vithal to begin calculating whether we could cannibalize any of the hull for CO2 scrubber media, a desperate, and probably pointless calculation, but the kind that occupies hands and minds. When the forward observation port lit up, docking lights, the amber and white docking lights on Thresh-9's ring, 2 came on in the standard guidance pattern. I did not say anything for several seconds. The docking lights cycled through their sequence. Amber pulse, white hold, amber pulse, white hold. The pattern of a station in active receiving mode. Full said very quietly, "That's not in the chart." "No," I said. The comm channel, the standard short-range docking frequency, crackled. A voice said, "Unregistered vessel on approach, this is Thresh-9. I have you on passive sensors, state your emergency." The voice was speaking in Accord trade tongue. The accent was wrong, not Velshar, not the standard coordinate accent. Something flatter and harder, with the consonants pushed forward in the mouth, the way some species push them, species that uses its lips as primary articulators. I had heard that accent before, but not often, and not in this context. I pressed the comm key. "This is Kethverol, labor transport, Veth Anoral massing," I said. "We have a failed primary drive and 3,014 workers aboard. Our atmospheric recyclers are at 49% efficiency. We have approximately 7 days of breathable air at current consumption." There was a pause, not a long pause. 4 or 5 seconds. Then the voice said, "Understood. Beginning pressurization on rings 2 and 3. Docking collar on ring 2 is functional. Approach on the amber guide. I'll have the collar seal checked before you extend your bridge. Don't rush it," I said. "Who are you?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "Station keeper," the voice said. "Dock first, talk later." We docked. His name was Davin Oral. I did not learn this immediately. The first thing I learned was the collar seal. He checked himself on the exterior surface of the docking ring in a pressure suit, while I waited at the bridge extension controls, watching through the observation port. He moved in the suit with the particular economy of a person who has spent a great deal of time working in one. No wasted motion, no hesitation, checking the seam joins in sequence with a small instrument that he ran around the full circumference of the collar before coming back inside. The whole check took 9 minutes. Then the comm clicked and the flat accented voice said, "Collar's good. Extend when ready," and I extended the bridge. He was human. I know that this should not have surprised me. The voice had told me what he was before I saw him. The accent, the plosive consonants, particular cadence of trade tongue, spoken by a species whose native language runs on entirely different musculature. But there is a difference between knowing a thing and having it stand in front of you. And Davin Oral was standing in the docking vestibule with his helmet under one arm and his pressure suit still sealed to the neck. And I stood in the bridge extension corridor with 6 of my limbs on the deck and looked at him. He was not tall for a human. The Accord's standard references on human physiology describe them as a medium-height bilaterally symmetric species with limited pigmentation, variation, and a notable absence of chitin, scales, or integumentary armor of any kind. A description that always struck me as dwelling unnecessarily on what they lack rather than what they have. But I have found that the Accord's survey documents on humans tend toward that kind of accounting. He had close-cropped gray-brown head fur, and the lines on his face that humans accumulate with age, and hands that were scarred across the knuckles and the palms, in the way that hands get when they are used for sustained manual work against metal and hard edges. He was thin in the way that beings get thin when they have been working hard and eating precisely enough and no more for a long time. He looked at me. He looked at the corridor behind me, where 2 of my secondary shift workers had come forward to see. He said, "How many injured?" I said, "Some. The air has been degraded for 4 days. Fatigue symptoms in approximately 200 workers. Possible early hypercapnia in 40 or 50 of the oldest. No trauma." He nodded once. "Pring 2 has functional life support. I have it running at standard parameters. Get your workers aboard in whatever order gets the worst air cases in first. Ring 3 is pressurized, but I'm still bringing the scrubbers up. Give me 2 hours on that before you start putting people in there. 4 is structural only. No life support, don't go in there." He paused. "Food is limited. I have protein stores that will cover approximately 300 workers for a standard week. I'll need to know what your species eats." I said. "How long have you been here?" he said. 14 months. I had nothing to say to that. He waited a moment, and then he said, "Get your sick ones off first," and turned and walked back into the station. And I stood in the docking vestibule and looked at the space where he had been standing, and tried to assemble the thing he had just told me into a shape I could comprehend. 14 months. The chart notations. The station had failed its operational review 14 months prior. That was when they had found it non-functional and closed the file on it. 14 months ago, a human had been here, and the station had been marked dead, and the chart had been updated with the gray notation and the derelict flag. And the human had what? Stayed? Been left? Been put here? I found out later. Not all at once, and not from Ofril himself, who answered direct questions in short, accurate sentences, and did not volunteer anything beyond what was useful in the moment. I found out from the station's maintenance logs, which he kept in meticulous handwritten notation in a physical binder, a practice I had not seen in 30 years of labor work. The handwritten log, and one that says something about a person's relationship with record-keeping, the particular kind of faith that says a written thing is more permanent than a filed thing. The log told me this. Thresh-9 had been an Accord auxiliary station, one of a series of mid-drift support platforms, built during the expansion period. It had been decommissioned as the expansion priorities shifted, its crew reassigned, its power plant throttled to minimum, operational file closed. The decommissioning order was filed on the same day that an Accord military tribunal had sentenced one warrant officer, Davin Oral, formerly of the Accord-aligned Human Colonial Auxiliary Forces, administrative exile, at the nearest available non-staffed installation for a period of not less than 18 standard months, on charges of insubordination and destruction of Accord property. The property in question was a tribunal record. He had deleted it. The record had contained orders for the forced labor reassignment of 600 Kethvaral workers. My species, though not workers I knew, to a mining operation in a radiation-adjacent sector, and he had deleted it from the administrative queue before it was executed. And when the tribunal asked him why, he had told them that the order was illegal under the labor compact and that he had done them the favor of removing it before it became a formal embarrassment. The tribunal had not seen it as a favor. The exile order specified a drop in departure. A shuttle had brought him to Thresh-9 with a survival allocation, 60 days of food, a basic toolkit, A single-channel emergency beacon that would transmit for 30 days before its power cell expired. And the shuttle had left. The station's official operational status had been updated to non-functional. The Accord's records showed no registered crew at Thresh-9. Accord's records, as far as the Accord was concerned, were accurate. He had started the log on the first day. The first entries are practical. Power assessment: the main reactor was at 7% not dead, and he noted this with no apparent emotional register. Just the number and what it meant in terms of what could be run at what sequence. Water reclamation: functional, but the filtration membranes needed replacement, and he listed what he could substitute from the station's maintenance stores. Food: 60 days, and he noted his daily consumption targets with the same flat precision. Air functional. He wrote air functional and underlined it once. Is the only underlining in the first 30 pages of the log, and I think about that underlining sometimes. The one thing he permitted himself to mark. By day 12, he had the reactor up to 19%, and the Ring 2 habitat block repressurized. By day 30, he had the water system fully operational and had begun working on the Ring 3 scrubbers, which had failed due to a degraded catalyst bed that he rebuilt from salvaged components. Process that the log documents over 11 days in the kind of technical detail that is either obsessive record-keeping or the writing of a person needs somewhere to put their attention. The emergency beacon died on day 31, as specified. He noted this in the log without comment and kept writing. By day 60, his food allocation ran out. The log notes this as a logistical entry. Day 60. Allocation exhausted. Beginning harvest protocol. Thresh-9 had a hydroponic bay in Ring 1, decommissioned, like everything else, structurally intact. He had spent 2 weeks preparing it before the allocation ran out. He was not caught unprepared. The log shows the preparation, clearly, the careful sequencing of work, to arrive at the moment of need with something already growing. He ate what the hydroponic bay produced and he kept working. By day 90, he had the navigation beacon functional. It was not the emergency beacon. That was dead, and he had no replacement power cell for it. It was the station's standard navigational marker, the one that tells passing vessels, there is a structure here, be aware of the hazard. He had rewired it to pulse on a standard distress frequency rather than the navigational warning frequency. A small reprogramming. The log notes the modification in 3 lines, and then continues to the next task. By day 120, he had begun work on the Ring 4 bulkhead seals. Not because they were urgent, but because they would eventually need attention, and he had the materials and the time. This was a pattern I noticed in the log as I read forward. He worked ahead. He did not wait for failures. He identified what would fail, in what order, at what interval, and he repaired the future before it arrived. It is the discipline of a person who understands that, in an isolated system, a problem deferred is a problem made larger, and that the time to fix a thing is when you have time to fix it, not when it is already breaking. The entries from days 90 to 300 are largely technical. Reactor maintenance, scrubber cycles, hydroponic yields. He tracked these carefully, noting which cultivars produced well in the station's cycled light conditions and which did not, adjusting planning schedules accordingly. He was feeding himself from a salvaged hydroponic bay in a decommissioned ring of an officially dead station, and he wrote down everything that worked and everything that did not with the same level attention, as if the record might someday be useful to someone. But not every entry was technical. There are scattered entries across the log, one every few weeks, sometimes less, that are different in character. They are shorter. They do not concern the station systems. They are observations, usually written in the evening by the log's internal timestamps, out the drift outside the viewport. What the gas giant's cloud bands look like at different times of the day cycle. The way the ring debris catches the primary's light at low angles. On day 156, he wrote 2 sentences about the silence, which is the only time in the log that he wrote about the silence at all. The outer drift is quieter than any place I have been. This is not a complaint. He did not return to the subject. On day 208, he wrote, checked the docking collar seals, all functional. I do this monthly now, even though there is no vessel expected. It seems like the right practices. On day 312, he wrote, "The beacon has been transmitting for 222 days on the distress frequency. No acknowledged receipt. This is consistent with the traffic data for this sector. I will keep transmitting." I read those entries in the Ring 2 common space while 3,000 workers slept around me, and I thought about what it means. To do a thing consistently for 222 days without acknowledgement and intend to continue. Most beings, when their actions produce no visible result for that length of time, begin to doubt the premise of the action. They revisit the decision. They ask whether they have been wrong about what is useful, what is possible, what is coming. I have done this myself, in smaller circumstances and over shorter periods. It is a natural motion of the mind, the questioning of an unanswered effort. The log shows no such revision. He did not revisit the beacon decision. He noted its status with the same register he used for the scrubber cycles: factual, current, ongoing. The beacon was transmitting. The sector was quiet. Both facts were simply the current conditions, neither better nor worse than expected. He wrote them down and moved to the next entry. I sat with the log in my manipulator limbs for a long time on the second day of our docking, in the Ring 2 common space that he had cleared and heated for our workers. And I thought about what it means to spend 90 days rebuilding a dead station alone, and then transmit a distress signal into space where no one knows you are on a frequency that the charts say belongs to a derelict structure, toward a drift lane that the Accord does not patrol. Thought about what it takes to do that, and then keep working for another 11 months. Maintaining the signal, maintaining the habitat, maintaining the log, writing it all down. He had not been waiting to be rescued. The log makes that clear. He had been keeping the station functional, because that was what there was to do, and he had been transmitting on the distress frequency. And that's nothing to transmit, and it might, at some low probability, be heard. He was not optimistic about it. The log does not read as optimistic. It reads as accurate, and there is a difference. On the fourth day of our docking, I found the section of the log headed station purpose. He had written it on day 45, 2 weeks after the beacon died, and 2 weeks into the hydroponic work. It is 2 paragraphs. I have read it many times since, and I will reproduce it here as accurately as I can from memory, because it belongs in this account. This station was built to support extended operations in the outer drift lanes, was decommissioned because those operations ended and the Accord found no further use for it. I have been placed here because the Accord found no further use for me. Both facts are administrative. Neither one means the station is actually useless, or that I actually have nothing to do. The outer drift lanes are used by unregistered and low registry traffic, labor transports, small freighters, colony resupply runs. These are vessels that the Accord does not prioritize. They have no claim on Accord rescue resources, and no formal recourse if something goes wrong in an unmonitored sector. Statistically, approximately 1 vessel per 8 to 12 months will experience a critical failure within beacon range of this position. I do not know when that vessel will arrive or what it will need. I know what this station can offer: pressure, air, water, power, and someone who answers the comm. I am going to keep those things functional. He had written that on day 45. Alone, with no food allocation, with a dead emergency beacon, with no reasonable prospect of the Accord reversing his exile order or anyone coming to find him. He had written a station keeper's charter for himself, on a dead station in the outer drift, and then he had gone back to work. 3,014 Kethvaral workers were breathing Ring 2 and Ring 3 air when I read that. I want to describe what the 31 hours of the rescue looked like, because it was not dramatic in the way that rescues in old navigation stories. Dramatic. There was no moment of crisis overcome, no single point at which everything hung in the balance and was resolved by a decisive act. It was work. Sustained, consecutive, unglamorous work performed by a human who had spent 14 months learning exactly what the station could not do, and who applied that knowledge with a thoroughness that I found, over those 31 hours, increasingly difficult to watch without feeling something I do not have a precise word for in trade tongue. There is a Kethfos concept. I will use the closest approximation called Veth Savar, which describes the particular discomfort of receiving generosity that you did not earn and cannot repay. It is not ingratitude. It is closer to the sensation of standing in a space that is larger than you expected, that has more room in it than you know what to do with. We experience it most acutely when the generosity is not performed, when it is simply the natural output of a person doing what they do, without expectation of acknowledgement. Oral worked without expectation of acknowledgement. He triaged the hypercapnia cases first. He had a medical kit that was 14 months old and partially depleted, and he stretched it with improvised treatments. Supplemental oxygen from the station's emergency tanks, which he had kept charged, and a manual breathing assist protocol he walked 2 of my senior workers through, so they could maintain it in shifts while he addressed the drive. He did not ask me whether I was grateful. He did not ask me whether I found it remarkable that he was here. He asked me for a list of the drive components that had failed, and he went into the Massing's engineering bay with a toolkit and a handheld diagnostic unit, and he started working. The drive was a 3-stage collapse. The primary field coil had shorted, which had caused a cascade into the secondary regulation assembly, which had locked the emergency containment in the closed position and prevented restart. He diagnosed this in 40 minutes. He told me it would take between 8 and 14 hours to correct, depending on whether the primary coil was repairable or required replacement. And he said this with the same tone he used for everything: level, informational, no particular stress on the bad news, and no particular brightness on the good. He found the coil was repairable. It took 11 hours. While he worked, I moved through the rings, checking on the workers. 3,014 Keth Viral, all of them labor caste, most of them in the middle years of their working life, trained for platform processing work and long-haul transport, and not much else. They had been frightened. They were less frightened now, because they were in breathable air for the first time in 4 days, and because there was a competent person working on the drive. But the less frightened state was fragile, and I moved through the rings and answered questions and tried to give them the accurate version of the situation, which was, the drive would be repaired, the air was safe. We did not yet know what happened next. What I did not tell them, because it was not useful to tell them, was that the accurate version of the situation still seemed improbable to me, that 3,000 workers in a dead sector had sent a beacon that the Accord had routed and filed, and that the only reply had come from a gray notation on a chart, and that the gray notation had turned out to be a human who had spent 14 months making himself useful in the place where the Accord had put him to be useless. I kept this to myself and answered questions and moved through the rings. I passed through the Ring 2 common space several times over those hours. Oral had prepared it for occupancy before we arrived. The floor grating was clear. The overhead lights were on. There were folded thermal sheets stacked at one end of the space in more or less the quantities required for 3,000 beings, which is a calculation he had no way to have made without knowing we were coming. When I asked him about it later, he said he kept the common space stocked for arrival at the current habitat capacity, that he reviewed the stocks monthly, that he had been short on thermal sheets for 2 months, and had been rationing his own to supplement the stack. He said it the way you say a logistical fact, without drama. I found this detail harder to sit with than almost anything else in the log: the thermal sheets. He had been sleeping with fewer coverings in an unheated station in the outer drift, so that the emergency supply would be adequate for an arrival he had no certainty would ever come. On the 19th hour, I brought him a meal from our own stores. We had food. Our failure had been the drive, not the provisions. And I sat in the engineering bay while he ate, and I asked him the question I had been working. Since I read the station log, I said, when your exile period ends, what happens? He ate for a moment. He had the particular relationship with food that beings develop when they have been working on precise rations for a long time. Attentive, unhurried, not rushed or eager, but fully present to it. He said, 18 months is the specified period, 4 more months. And then, he considered this. File a return claim with the Accord Colonial Auxiliary Administrative Office. Wait for processing. Approximately 6 to 12 months. He paused. Probably closer to 12. I'm not a priority case, I said. You deleted an order that would have sent 600 of my species into a radiation-adjacent mining sector, he said. I did. Which you were exiled here for 18 months. Yes. I watched him eat. Outside the engineering bay, through the hull, 3,000 workers were breathing air that he had spent 14 months maintaining for whoever might need it. The recyclers hummed. The station creaked slightly. The thermal expansion and contraction of a structure that has been lived in, I said. The Accord doesn't know you rebuilt this station, he said. The Accord's records show it non-functional. I haven't corrected that. Why not? He thought about that. He set down the food container and looked at his hands for a moment. The scarred knuckles, calluses along the tool grip edges of his palms, and then he said, the navigation beacon transmits on a standard distress frequency. Any vessel that needed to find it could find it. Any vessel that didn't need it wouldn't look. I sat with that answer for a while. Then I said, you built here. The station, the habitat, the hydroponics, the beacon. None of that is in the Accord record. No, it will be now, I said. I file a full incident report. 3,014 workers, a failed drive in the outer drift, rescued by an operational station at the Thresh primary L4 point. Station keeper, identified as Warrant Officer Davin Oral. I paused. Will be accurate. He looked at me. He had dark eyes, the color that appears in human irises that carry a lot of pigment, and at that moment they were level and without particular expression. He said, that's your call to make, Foreman. I know, I said. He nodded once and picked up the food container and finished eating, and then he went back to the drive. He finished the repair at hour 26. Primary coil tested clean. He restarted the secondary regulation assembly in sequence, checked the containment release manually, ran the startup protocol twice. The drive turned over on the second attempt. The sound it made, the deep harmonic of a functional drive coming up to idle, went through the massing like something physical. I heard it in the common spaces. The change in the noise, the change in the air pressure, the change in the small background sounds that a vessel makes when it is being powered by its own systems again. And then I heard the workers. I have been on labor platforms for 11 years. I have heard work crews in most of the emotional registers that sustained labor work produces, the dull exhaustion of a long cycle, the sharp focus of an emergency repair, the specific kind of noise that 3,000 bees and fee in poor air make when they have been frightened for 4 days. I had not, before that moment, 3,000 Kethvaral workers hear a drive come up to idle after 5 days of silence. The sound they made was not a cheer. It was not organized. It was the sound of 3,000 bodies releasing something they had been holding. A collective exhale that became, briefly, something close to a vibration that I felt in my own exoskeleton. I stood in the Ring 2 corridor and put my foremost limbs on the bulkhead and felt it. Oral came out of the engineering bay 17 minutes later. He had a grease transfer across one side of his face, and he was carrying his tool. Kit, he said to no one in particular, drives up. You can run a full diagnostic at your discretion, tested clean at idle, and I'd expect it to test clean at thrust. I said, thank you, he said, run the diagnostic anyway. I said, I will, thank you. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, the scrubbers in Ring 3 need a new catalyst bed in the next 90 days or they'll start declining again. I have notes on the rebuild procedure. He paused. I'll write them out clean so your engineers can follow them. He spent the last 5 hours of our docking writing out maintenance procedures for every system on the station. Handwritten, in the same binder as the log, in the same level notation, as if this were simply the next section of the record, rather than the beginning of a new 1. I watched him for part of it, from the doorway of the common space where 3,000 workers were sleeping or talking or eating their first full meal in 5 days. He sat at the station's maintenance workbench with the binder open and wrote with the methodical pace of a person who has done a great deal of handwriting and has learned that speed does not improve it. His hand moved without hesitation. He did not draft and revise. He wrote the procedure from the beginning to the end in the order a technician would need to follow it, as if the sequence were already fully formed and he was simply transcribing it. I thought about how many times he had performed each of those procedures alone. How many cycles of the scrubbers? How many reactor inspections? How many seal checks on the docking ring for a vessel that had never come until we came. He had maintained every system on this station on a schedule, in the dark for 14 months. He knew the procedures the way you know things that your hands have learned, separately from your mind. He covered the Ring 2 scrubbers in 11 pages, the reactor maintenance protocol in 17, the hydroponic bay, cultivar selection, planting density, the light cycle timing that his specific bay required, in 9, the docking collar inspection in 4. He numbered each section and wrote a brief index at the front, the way you do when you are writing something you intend to be used, not merely read. At the end he wrote a final note that was not a procedure. I read it later from my copy of the binder. It said, "These procedures maintain the station at the level described in the service log. A crew of 2 could perform the full maintenance cycle in approximately 12 hours per standard week. A crew of 1 can do it in 18 to 20, depending on pace. The station is viable long-term at either staffing level. The hydroponic bay will sustain 1 person indefinitely. Expansion of the second bay in Ring 1 it would sustain 4. Ring 4 bulkhead seals should be re-inspected at month 6. Everything else is in the log." He wrote, "Everything else is in the log," and closed the binder. I stood in the doorway and watched him close it, and I thought, that is what 14 months looks like. A binder full of handwritten procedures and a note that says the station is viable. Not a summary of his own suffering, a handoff document. When I came to tell him we were ready to depart, he handed me the binder. I said, "You should keep this," he said. "I'll start a new one." I held the binder. It was heavier than I expected. A full 14 months of log entries, maintenance records, the station purpose paragraphs, the catalyst bed rebuild instructions, the hydroponic planting schedules, calm frequency modifications, the daily consumption targets from day 1. The record of a person deciding to be useful in a place that everyone else had decided was useless. I said, "Come with us." He looked at me. I said, "Exile period is 4 months from completion. I am the senior representative of 3014 Kethfaral workers who were rescued by an Accord-registered station keeper in the performance of his recorded duties. I can file a service completion claim on your behalf that will require the Accord Colonial Auxiliary Administrative Office to process your return within 40 standard days rather than 12 months. The legal basis is clear. You have maintained an Accord auxiliary installation beyond your specified service term and completed an emergency rescue operation. The administrative office cannot ignore a service completion claim on file with 1,014 named supporting witnesses." He was quiet for a long time. I said, 4 months, 40 days. The difference is yours to choose." He looked at the ring around us, the habitat block he had pressurized, the scrubbers he had rebuilt, the lights he had kept on for 14 months for whoever might need them. He looked at the binder in my manipulator limbs. He said, "The station will go back to non-functional if I leave." I said, "Yes." He thought about that. He thought about it for longer than I expected, and I watched him think. And I understood that this was not a simple calculation for him. He had made something here. He had taken a dead station in the outer drift and built it into something that worked, and kept it working through 14 months of solitude on the premise that someone might someday need it. The station was not an accident. It was not a response to the emergency. It had been built before the emergency, for the emergency, by a person who decided in advance that the outer drift needed someone paying attention to, he said. "Who takes the station?" I said. "That is a question for the Accord administrative process. But I will note in my incident report that the station should be maintained. And I will note the reasons why. And I will note the population of vessels that use the outer drift lanes and have no formal Accord rescue access. 3,014 witnesses is a substantial number of reasons." He was quiet. I said, "I am not telling you the Accord will act on it. I'm telling you what I will file," he said. "That's fair." He packed 1 bag. It did not take long. 14 months of accumulated possessions in 1 bag, which tells you something about how a person lives when they have decided that accumulation is not the point. He went through the station once before we left. I did not follow him. I waited at the docking collar and gave him that time alone. I do not know what he did in those final minutes inside. I do not know whether he stood at the Ring 2 viewport and looked at the gas giant's cloud, bands the way he had described in the log, or whether he went to the hydroponic bay and looked at the growing things he would leave behind, or whether he simply walked the corridors in the way that a person walks a space they know by memory and wants to know once more before it changes. He had spent 14 months alone in that station, and I had been there for 31 hours, and what it meant to him to leave it was not something I could know from the outside. I only know that when he came back, his face was the way faces get when a person has finished something, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, just complete. We departed Thresh-9 at hour 31. The docking lights stayed on behind us as we pulled away. He had left them on, the amber and white guidance pattern, cycling through their sequence into the empty drift. I watched them in the aft observation port until the distance made them too small to see. I filed the incident report 4 days later, at Marin Hub. I filed it complete and accurate. The failed drive, the 5 days of degraded air, the beacon on all frequencies, the automated responses, the Accord's routing notice, the chart notation for Thresh-9. And then I filed the section that covered what actually happened, which is, to a station the chart said was dead. The lights were already on, and a human who had been placed there to die had instead spent 14 months making it a station worth docking at, and in doing so had saved 3,014 lives that the Accord had already administratively written off as outside their patrol area and outside their responsibility. I filed it as routine under the Labor Compact Emergency Recovery Clause. I listed Devon Oral as station keeper of record, service period 14 months, rescue operation completed, service completion claim attached with 3,014 witness signatures. I filed the claim the way you file a thing that is straightforwardly true and therefore requires no particular argument, just accurate documentation. Processing clerk at Marin Hub looked at the claim for a long time. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the claim again. She said, Thresh-9 is listed as non-functional. I said, I know. The station keeper's log covers the discrepancy. I've included it as supporting documentation. She looked at the binder. I had made a copy before giving it to Oral, a full photographic record of every page, and included it in the filing package. She said, this will require administrative review. I said, yes, I expect it will, she said. The review process takes, I said, 40 standard days under the service completion emergency provision, with 3,014 witnesses on file. I am familiar with the provision. So is the collective's legal coordinator, who has reviewed the filing and is prepared to escalate if the timeline is not observed. She looked at me again. I held my foremost limbs still, which is a Kethvaral effort of politeness. The natural position when processing something irritating is to spread them, and I kept them still. She stamped the claim. Oral's return authorization came through in 33 days. I know this because he sent me a brief message, the human custom of a short written note, which I found appropriate given the binder, that said only, Oralization approved. Departing Marin Hub for Colonial Auxiliary Processing. Thank you for the filing. I sent back, thank you for keeping the lights on. He did not reply to that, which is also appropriate. I have one more thing to include in this account. It is not about Oral directly. It is about what I found when I went back to the sector chart after we docked at Marin Hub and looked at the outer drift lanes. There are, as best I can determine from the publicly accessible registry data, between 4 and 7 vessels per standard year that pass through the outer drift sector containing Thresh primary. They are, almost uniformly, low registry labor transports, small freighters, and colonial resupply runs. The categories of vessel that the Accord classifies as operating in undesignated sectors at their own navigational risk. They have no claim on Accord rescue resources. If something goes wrong in that sector, the automated beacon routing buoy will acknowledge their signal and forward it to Marin Hub, where it will be logged and prioritized below the active patrol corridors. Thresh-9 is in that sector. The Accord's records still show it non-functional. I filed an amendment to my incident report recommending the station be reclassified as auxiliary, active, with a minimal maintenance crew, and citing the specific vessel traffic density data and the absence of Accord rescue coverage in the sector. I attached the station keeper's log. I attached the maintenance records Aurel wrote out for me, the clean handwritten procedures for every system. I attached the station purpose paragraphs. I noted that all of this documentation was produced by a single human working alone with a basic toolkit and 60 days of initial food allocation, and that the station he produced from those inputs had been sufficient to receive, house, and facilitate the repair of a vessel carrying 3,014 workers. I noted that if the Accord chose not to maintain the station would return to non-functional, and the outer drift lanes would return to having no coverage, and the vessels that used them would return to having no recourse. I noted that this was a choice the Accord was free to make. I did not note, in the official filing, what I actually think about that choice, which is that the outer drift lanes will eventually kill someone who did not need to die, and that the Accord will file the loss under undesignated sector risk and close the case, and that the chart will continue to show for Thresh-9 in gray notation with a small derelict status flag, and that the only difference between that future and a different one is whether someone decides to keep the lights on. Oral decided. 14 months, with no food allocation and a dead beacon and a chart that said the station was dead, he decided. I do not know what the Accord will decide. I know what I filed. I know that when we cleared the L4 point, and I looked back at Thresh-9 in the aft observation port, it looked the same as when we had approached it. A dark hull, folded arrays, the collapsed profile of a decommissioned platform that any navigator would log as a hazard and pass. Except for the docking lights, which Oral had left running, amber and white, cycling through their sequence. The pattern of a station in active receiving mode, transmitting into the outer drift toward any vessel that might need to find it. The chart will still show it non-functional. The gray notation will still be there, and the derelict status flag, and the last active survey date of 14 months prior. None of that has changed. The lights were on when we needed them. They were still on when we left. In the Kethvaral Labor Collective Incident Archive, file reference VKC 9941 Emergency Recovery, as a routine operational record. The classification is accurate. The events described were not routine. I have noted this discrepancy in the archive index for the attention of whoever reads it next. Saga, Shift Foreman First Class, Kethvaral Labor Collective Marin Hub, standard date on file.